Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Hannan Hever, who is the Jacob and Hilda Blaustein Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of Comparative Literature at Yale. He studies the cultural history of modern Hebrew poetry and prose, the theory of cultural and literary critique, and the history and politics of the Hassidic tale. He has written a number of publications on these topics in both Hebrew and English. Today we'll talk with Professor Hever about his new book, Hebrew Literature and the 1948 War, Essays on Philology and Responsibility. Welcome, Professor Hever.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
Basically, what we have there is 10 chapters, and the basic theme is trying to understand the relationship between the Nakba, meaning disaster. Nakba is an Arabic term, and try to negotiate between the literature and what happened in Palestine during the 48 war. By this I mean the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians and basically destroying dozens of villages, Palestinian villages. And the idea is to check what's going on, how literature represent this extremely disaster event and events for the Palestinian in Palestine, and try to understand what do we mean by Hebrew literature, meaning Jewish literature. How the Jews using literature to reflect, to understand what went on during this period.
Okay, and what led you to want to write this book?
First of all, morality. I feel as an Israeli citizen, I have a commitment, I have responsibility. What happened in 48, despite the fact I'm younger. But I think this is the main issue for many Israelis, to take responsibility what happened to the Palestinians from our side. So this is the main idea. But second,
sure.
But as a literary scholar, what I want to analyze is the linguistic structure, literary structure, like plots, characters, the design of the landscape, and many other things like this, which you use to take care or to deal when you are trying to understand it from a literary scholarship point of view.
All right, and how are you doing? Tell us about the methodology you're using. How are you doing the research for the book?
First of all, I chose created kind of selection of canonical texts, Hebrew fiction, Hebrew poetry. The next stage was try to locate them in this very specific military, politically, and more than this, morally situation. And then, which for me is very important, the issue of theory. It's so complicated, talking about testimony, trauma, issue, how you represent violence by literature, all this raising, and of course the question about responsibility. It's a huge and very important question. Try to understand what does it mean by writing literature you take responsibility. It's very complicated from a theoretical point of view.
Okay. So let's talk about that a little bit. How do you think one would take responsibility?
First of all, let us define responsibility. Responsibility is a response. You respond and you answer to a question. You have like a depth. You need to do something vis-a-vis what you see, what you know, from historical materials and so on. So if you try to understand responsibility, meaning how do as a writer you involve? How do you involve in such a situation for morality? If it's something that has to do with a real and important answer from ethical point of view, you should understand what the influence on this kind of stance vis-a-vis what's going on, the deeds, the disaster, how you deal with the language of the literature. This is the main issue.
Okay. So you argue in your book that Hebrew literature basically fails to take responsibility for the Nakba. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah. Many examples, many. I cannot summarize all of them right now.
Sure.
Just an example,
Yes.
Displacement. You are describing something like a conflict of morality, of ethics. Conflict, you have, for example, one of the most famous writers in Israeli literature, Samach Yizhar, is basically the leading figure. He wrote a story about the prisoner, Palestinian prisoner.
Okay.
And the idea, what went on through his mind is if he should release this Palestinian, because it's very clear that there's no real reason to get him.
Okay.
So what is interesting, until almost the very last moment, there's no decision to still keep him or to release him. The solution of Yizhar is displacement. Instead of taking a real stance vis-a-vis what's going on with the prisoner, he moved with his gaze to the landscape, and nothing really is solved.
Okay. Can you give us another example?
Yes. For example, one more, so many.
Yes.
The national poet, Natan Alterman, is the national poet during this year. He wrote a very famous poem about the behavior, attacking the behavior of the Israeli army during the Nakba. But if you read it carefully, it's very interesting, because at the very end you understand that for him it's a negative exception. It's not something, a regular behavior of the Israeli army. And this, again, is quite a way that he can detach himself from any commitment to take a real responsibility, more of morality. Okay,
and then the language of modern Hebrew poetry and fiction, you also argue, reflects the symptoms of violence, Israeli national violence. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. This issue of metaphor, which is a basic figure in the literary language. It's a metaphor. When a writer or one of the characters in the story look directly, have a gaze. There's a very specific gaze of looking directly to what's going on around him. But the fact is that what happens there, he creates like a metaphoric structure that basically, instead of looking and seeing the Palestinian, what's going on with the Palestinian, what he finds is himself. Basically, it's a mirroring. The metaphor is based on like connecting two fields of meanings. And what he is doing, he defines himself as someone which is very close to the Palestinian, but the Palestinian has never been existed in the story. He himself
And what do you ultimately conclude in your book?
I'll use my former book to try to formulate kind of a connection or a narrative that goes from my first book to the new one. The former book in English was called Suddenly the Sight of War. And basically what I did there is trying to understand the way that the Hebrew literature represented the Holocaust. Or I prefer the name Horban in Yiddish because this was the language of the victims. Holocaust is American or Israeli contemporary term. Anyway, the basic idea was like this, still like this. In the Israeli culture, the main narrative by which the culture, even the policy, contains what happened during the 20th century, meaning the Holocaust, Horban, and 48 war, is by creating a narrative, teleological narrative, from disaster, from Holocaust to redemption. I think it's a fake one. And this is a fake one, and it basically removes any real representation, what really happened, without kind of misleading ideology. So the first one, the former one, I devote a lot of energy to understand what happened during the war, or more than this, how we can define the consciousness of the Jews immediately after the Holocaust and during the Holocaust. The problem for the Jewish people, inside and outside, was to recognize the fact that the Jewish people were defeated during the war. It's very difficult because if you are defeated, it's very difficult to move from this situation to kind of redemptive stage. So the first book, the former book, is about try to understand how the major poet, the national poet Alterman, basically gave us kind of recognition of the fact that Jewish people were defeated during the war. So this is the reason why why he could go forward and tell us what happened during the war, during the Nakba. I'm not saying it's so simple, but this was my idea. My conclusion is that the new book is trying to understand how, if you ignore, or if you suppress, or if you remove, it's much better, the narrative, the fake narrative from Shoah to redemption, then we can understand deeply what is the way we can take responsibility of what's going on now, and of course 48, without covering it with the language of redemption.
Okay. What are your next steps?
First of all, I've changed my field. For more than 40 years, even more, I'm writing about modernism.
Okay.
Hebrew literature in modernity, modernist Hebrew literature. To be honest, I fed up. I told to myself, Hannan, enough. After more than 40 years, you should rest and detach yourself from this topic. Now I moved to 18th century and 19th century, and my main field of research is Hassidic tale.
Okay.
Or let us put it more precise way, the politics of the Hassidic way, Hassidic tale. And I enjoy it.
Okay. Well, we will look forward to seeing more work from you on that topic then. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Hever and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you.